Welcome to Karen Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in. The first sign of trouble was the sound of car doors slamming one after another, like someone was assembling a battalion in my front yard. I jerked awake, groggy and irritated, already knowing something was wrong. It was too early for this. Too damn early. I stumbled to my window, pulled back the curtain, and nearly dropped my coffee cup. My private property was covered in cars. SUVs, luxury sedans, and even a few golf carts littered my field like a damn shopping mall parking lot. People, strangers, were walking around, stretching, chatting, sipping coffee like they were at a tailgate party. And at the center of it all, a woman with an expensive-looking blazer and a clipboard, barking orders like a general. I didn't need an introduction to know exactly what she was. An HOA Karen. Fury surged through me as I grabbed my boots and stormed outside. My old farm dog, Rusty, barking furiously at my side. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the morning air. "What the hell is going on here?" Clipboard Karen turned to face me, her perfectly styled blonde bob unmoving in the breeze, like it had been engineered for peak smugness. She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile a predator gives prey before the kill. "Good morning," she chirped, her voice dripping with fake pleasantry. "I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association. We're just using the designated community overflow parking for today's charity golf tournament. Should all be wrapped up by this afternoon." I blinked, my brain trying to process the sheer audacity of what I was hearing. "This isn't community overflow parking," I said, voice tight. "This is my farm. My private property. You're trespassing." Margaret's fake smile didn't budge. Instead, she flipped through her clipboard. "Oh, there must be some confusion. This area has been used for community events for years. It's listed in our HOA bylaws as an approved auxiliary parking lot." I laughed. Actually laughed. "I don't give a damn what your bylaws say," I snapped, stepping closer. "This land has been in my family for generations. We're not part of your HOA." Margaret's perfectly manicured fingers stopped flipping through papers. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, her expression faltered. She didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, her voice losing its sugar-coated veneer, "your property is adjacent to our neighborhood, and the previous HOA board had an understanding with the former owner. So this land has been considered part of our community's shared resources for quite some time. My grandfather would never agree to that," I growled. "And unless you have a document with my signature on it, you have exactly 10 minutes to get every single one of these cars off my land before I start calling tow trucks." Behind me, Rusty growled low, clearly sensing my anger. A few of the HOA members actually had the nerve to look annoyed, as if I was the one inconveniencing them. Margaret's smile twitched, just slightly, but she wasn't done yet. "Mr. Davis, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. Evergreen Meadows is home to several important figures in this town. City officials, business leaders, even a judge." My stomach twisted. Ah, there it was. The power play. She was so sure she could bully me with a thinly veiled threat. Like I was some clueless farmer who would bow down to HOA royalty. Unfortunately for her, I don't scare easily. "I don't care if the President of the United States lives in your little cul-de-sac," I said coldly. "You're all trespassing. And I'm giving you one last warning." Margaret's eyes burned with irritation, but before she could speak, a voice from the crowd interrupted. "Margaret, maybe we should just move the cars." I turned to see a middle-aged man in golf attire, shifting uncomfortably. A few others were whispering, clearly realizing they were on the wrong side of this argument. Margaret's face snapped toward them, her mask of politeness cracking. "No one is moving their cars," she hissed, before turning back to me. "And if you call a tow truck, I will personally see to it that you are sued for harassment, interference with a community event, and damage to public property." I blinked. Public property? Then it hit me. Margaret actually believed she owned my land. Or, at the very least, she thought she could take it. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to bury her. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of every single license plate in my field. Then, very deliberately, I dialed the sheriff's office. Margaret's eyes widened in shock. She lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. "You need to think carefully about this," she hissed. I yanked my arm away. "You just added assault to your list of crimes." Margaret's perfectly polished confidence crumbled. I turned my back on her and lifted the phone to my ear. "Yeah, Sheriff? I need to report mass trespassing and property damage. And I'd like a few tow trucks sent out here as soon as possible." The second I said it, Margaret's entire demeanor changed. She wasn't smug anymore, she was terrified. And for the first time that morning, I felt something close to satisfaction. Because Margaret had finally realized something. She wasn't the one in control. I was. Margaret's eyes darted to my phone like it was a loaded weapon. For the first time since this absurdity began, she looked genuinely nervous. I turned slightly, making sure my voice carried. Yes, Sheriff. I've got dozens of trespassers on my property, and they're refusing to leave. Some of them are damaging my crops, and I need a tow company here immediately. Margaret's hand flew up in protest. Wait, this isn't necessary. We can. I held up a finger. Not now, Margaret. Yeah. I continued into the phone, eyes locked onto hers. They're claiming my land belongs to their HOA. But I have my deed right here proving otherwise. Margaret's face drained of color. You don't have to do this, she hissed, voice low but sharp. Desperate. Oh, but I do, I said, smiling for the first time that morning. Margaret turned on her heels, whipping toward the crowd of onlookers. Everyone, into your cars. Now. She barked. The entitled suburbanites hesitated, unsure if they should listen. Some of them, especially the ones who had been whispering earlier, looked ready to bolt. Others still clung to whatever fantasy Margaret had fed them, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. As if I was the one being unreasonable. Margaret tried again. We're leaving. Everyone move. Still, some people hesitated. Now, she snapped, voice shrill. That got them moving. Engines roared to life as a chaotic, panicked exodus began. SUVs tore up the ground as they reversed in a hurry, tires spitting dirt and dust into the morning air. I crossed my arms and watched. Victory never looked so good. Rusty, my ever-faithful farm dog, barked at every single car as they fled. Margaret's black SUV was the last to move. But instead of leaving, she rolled down her window and fixed me with a glare so full of venom. I could practically taste it. You're making a lot of enemies today, Mr. Davis, she said through gritted teeth. I leaned against my fence post, unfazed. Good. Then I'll always see them coming. Margaret's smug mask cracked, just a little. Then she hit the gas and sped off down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind her. I took a deep breath, relishing the silence that followed. My land was mine again. Or so I thought. The first official retaliation came the next day. I found the notice taped to my front door, written on HOA letterhead. A $5,000 fine for unauthorized agricultural activities and non-compliant landscaping. I read it twice, my anger growing with every word. Not only was it absolute nonsense, but it was proof that Margaret wasn't done with me yet. I marched inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed the county records office. Frank, my new best friend, picked up. Davis, I was just about to call you. That wasn't what I expected. Why? Frank sighed. Because Margaret's been real busy. He explained that Margaret and her HOA cronies had filed paperwork with the county, attempting to reclassify my land as part of Evergreen Meadows. I nearly dropped my phone. They can't do that. They sure can try, Frank said. And if they push hard enough, they could tie you up in legal hell for years. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to think. If Margaret was willing to pull something this underhanded, what else was she planning? I needed leverage. Something that would force her to back off. That's when Frank dropped another bombshell. By the way, he said, flipping through records. Did you know your land has the main electrical transformer for their entire community? My breath caught. Say that again? Frank chuckled. Yeah, your grandfather signed an easement years ago, letting the power company run lines through your land. The main transformer that powers Evergreen Meadows? It sits right on your property. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. Margaret just screwed herself. By the time I got back to my farm, I had already made 3 phone calls. First, to Pinewood Electric, confirming my control over the transformer. Second, to my lawyer Oliver, who was already drafting a countersuit against Margaret and the HOA. And third, to the local news station. Margaret wanted a fight? She just got one. I parked my truck and stepped outside, just in time to see a white luxury car pulling into my driveway. Margaret. She stepped out, smug as ever. But there was something desperate in the way she held herself. Mr. Davis, she greeted, forcing a smile. I think we got off on the wrong foot. I crossed my arms. That's funny, because I think you got off on my land. Her smile tightened. There's no need to escalate this further. If you sign this agreement, we can resolve this peacefully. She handed me a stack of papers. I glanced at them. HOA membership forms. I laughed. Actually laughed. You think I'm going to sign my land over to you? I asked. After everything you've done? Margaret's smile vanished. I think, she said icily, that you should consider your options. Because if you don't, things might get complicated. Ah, there it was, the veiled threat. I took a slow step forward, watching as she fought the urge to step back. You know what else is complicated? I said, pulling out the county records document. The fact that your entire neighborhood gets power from my land. Margaret's smirk disappeared entirely. I folded my arms. Now tell me, Margaret, who do you think holds the real power here? Margaret's face twisted into something ugly in expression, I imagine. She reserved for waiters who didn't refill her wine fast enough, or neighbors who dared to paint their mailbox the wrong shade of beige. You think this changes anything? She hissed, voice low, almost conspiratorial. I grinned. Oh, I know it does. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard, her manicured nails digging into the cheap plastic. She opened her mouth probably to spew another half-baked threat, but I wasn't done. You've been treating my land like your personal property, Margaret, I said, and now you've got a real problem. Because I just got off the phone with Pinewood Electric. Turns out, that transformer? I pointed casually toward the back field, where a large green metal box sat beneath a row of poles. That powers every single house in Evergreen Meadows. Margaret's entire body went rigid. I took a slow step forward, enjoying how she flinched slightly. Ah, there it was, the moment she realized she wasn't holding the bigger stick. If I revoke the easement, I continued, Pinewood has no legal choice but to shut it down until a new location is approved. Which could take. I tapped my chin, pretending to think. 6 months? Maybe a year? Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly. You wouldn't dare. I folded my arms. Try me. Her eyes flickered, calculating, scrambling, trying to find a new angle. I could see it now, the gears turning in her perfectly coiffed head. Margaret wasn't used to losing. I'm sure there's a reasonable solution here, she finally said, forcing a smile that looked more like a pained grimace. We can discuss this, civilly. I arched a brow. Like how you civilly fined me $5,000 for planting crops on my own land? Her lips pursed, the mask slipping again. That was simply a misunderstanding. Oh, was it? Like how you tried to reclassify my land as HOA property. I tilted my head. Or how you directed dozens of cars to trample my fields. Margaret flushed. That was, or, I cut her off, enjoying how she nearly choked on her own excuses. How you just threatened me. Her hands trembled. Behind her, the SUV door cracked open, and Jeffrey, the HOA's pet lawyer, stepped out, adjusting his tie. Oh, this just kept getting better. Mr. Davis, he greeted smoothly, striding toward us with the confidence of a man who had no idea he was about to lose. Perhaps we can all take a step back and reassess. No need for hostilities. Hostilities? I echoed. Your client trespassed, lied, fined me illegally, and attempted to steal my land. And now you want to assess? Jeffrey chuckled, the kind of empty, patronizing sound that probably worked wonders on intimidated homeowners who missed an HOA payment. I understand your frustrations, he said. But Evergreen Meadows is a prestigious community. It thrives on order. We can't have, spare me the speech, I cut in. I don't care about your prestige. I care about my property rights. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Like I was the problem here. Alex, if you just agree to sign the HOA membership, we can resolve this amicably. I barked out a laugh. You think I'd willingly put myself under your rule? After this disaster? Jeffrey's eye twitched. This doesn't have to get ugly. Oh, but it already has, I said, flipping open the folder in my hand. Because I just filed a formal complaint with the county regarding your fraudulent property claims. And since I have a legally recorded deed that explicitly states Evergreen Meadows has zero jurisdiction over my land, I imagine the county is going to be very interested in your little stunt. Margaret paled. Jeffrey's confident facade wavered. But I wasn't done. I also spoke with my lawyer, who's preparing a harassment and trespassing suit against Evergreen Meadows and its board. I let that sink in before delivering the final blow. Oh, and did I mention? The local news station is running a special feature on HOA abuse next week. They're very eager to hear my story. Margaret's breath hitched. Jeffrey's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I could almost smell their fear. Margaret took a shaky breath, visibly forcing herself to regain control. Mr. Davis, she started, her tone measured but strained. Surely, we can come to some arrangement that… Oh, we will, I said, snapping my folder shut. Here's my counteroffer. You drop the fines, revoke any fraudulent claims to my land, and formally acknowledge that my farm is not, and never will be, part of your HOA. Silence. Margaret looked like she wanted to scream. Jeffrey glanced at her, then back at me. And if we refuse? I smiled. Then I call Pinewood Electric, and by next week, Evergreen Meadows will be living by candlelight. Margaret's nostrils flared. Jeffrey's face turned an impressive shade of white. It was over. I could see the moment they realized it. The moment they knew they had no leverage left. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Fine, she spat. Jeffrey nodded stiffly. We'll have the paperwork drawn up. I leaned against my porch railing, letting my grin widen. Pleasure doing business with you. Margaret turned on her heel, storming back to her car with all the grace of a dictator retreating from a failed coup. Jeffrey followed, rubbing his temples like he had the migraine of the century. I watched as their SUV sped away, kicking up dust, taking the last remnants of their arrogance with them. Rusty sat beside me, wagging his tail. I reached down, scratching behind his ear. Well, buddy, I said, exhaling slowly, that was fun. I should have known Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. For 2 whole days, everything was quiet. Too quiet. No smug visits, no HOA notices mysteriously appearing on my door. No entitled suburbanites trespassing on my land. I almost let myself believe it was over. Then, on the 3rd morning, I found a sheriff's car parked in my driveway. I barely had time to process before Sheriff Reynolds stepped out, adjusting his belt. His expression unreadable. Morning, Alex, he greeted. Mind telling me why I got a report saying you've been tampering with public utilities? I exhaled sharply, already knowing exactly where this was going. Let me guess, I said, crossing my arms. The HOA? Reynolds sighed. Anonymous complaint, but yeah, we both know who filed it. Of course. Margaret had gone nuclear. They're claiming you messed with the transformer, Reynolds continued. That you were seen trying to sabotage the community's power supply. I barked out a laugh. That's rich. I own the land the transformer sits on. Why the hell would I sabotage my own property? Reynolds gave me a long look, then glanced at the security cameras I had installed last week. I smirked. Want to see footage of the only person who's actually been sneaking around the transformer? Reynolds' eyebrows lifted slightly. You got something? Oh yeah, I said, pulling out my phone. I got something. I scrolled through the footage and hit play. The grainy night vision video showed exactly what I expected. Margaret, skulking around the transformer like a cartoon villain, flashlight in hand, clearly trying to mess with it. Reynolds leaned over my shoulder, watching in silence as Margaret fumbled with the access panel. Then, clear as day, she turned toward the camera, her face fully visible, before scurrying off like a raccoon caught in a trash can. Reynolds let out a slow whistle. Well, damn. I snapped my phone shut. So, Sheriff, do I need to come down to the station? Or do you have a trespassing charge to file? Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'll take care of it. Margaret was about to have a very bad day. Turns out, Margaret wasn't just playing dirty, she was playing desperate. The very next afternoon, I got another surprise visit. This time, from Jeffrey, the HOA lawyer. I didn't even bother inviting him to sit down. I just stood on my porch, arms crossed, waiting for whatever ridiculous legal threat he was about to deliver. Jeffrey cleared his throat. Mr. Davis, he began, trying to sound diplomatic. We have a proposal that we believe is mutually beneficial. I raised an eyebrow. You mean Margaret finally realized she lost? A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. Given the recent developments, the board has decided to revoke the fines and drop the claims against your land. I pretended to think. And Jeffrey hesitated. In exchange, we would ask that you reconsider blocking access to the transformer. I laughed. Actually laughed. So, let me get this straight. Margaret tries to steal my land, frame me for a crime, and now that she's backed into a corner, you want me to be generous? Jeffrey sighed, adjusting his tie. Alex, this is bigger than just you and Margaret. There are families in Evergreen Meadows who rely on that power. Kids. Elderly residents. This isn't just an HOA issue anymore. I tilted my head. Sounds like a problem for the power company. Not my problem. Alex, you know what? I interrupted. Let's talk about those county grants Margaret filed for using my land's acreage. How many thousands of dollars has the HOA collected by fraudulently listing my farm as part of the community? Jeffrey's jaw tightened. Yeah, I thought so. Look, I get it, I said. You're just the cleanup guy. But I'll tell you what, I'll consider the transformer situation. When Margaret publicly admits to her fraud, resigns, and agrees to compensate me for the damages her little parking lot stunt caused. Jeffrey's face darkened. That's not going to happen. I shrugged. Then neither is my cooperation. Silence. Then, finally, Jeffrey stood up, dusted off his expensive suit, and sighed. I hope you reconsider, he said stiffly. Because this isn't over, I smirked. Oh, I know. But it will be soon. He gave me one last hard look before getting into his car and driving off. And just like that I knew. Margaret's reign was on its last legs. I barely had time to enjoy my victory before Margaret pulled her last, desperate stunt. 2 days after Jeffrey's failed negotiation, I woke up to the sound of metal clanking outside. My gut immediately told me something was off. Rusty was already barking his head off on the porch, his fur bristling. I grabbed my boots, threw on a jacket, and stormed outside, and nearly lost my damn mind. A group of men in reflective vests were cutting through my fence. Not just any men. Contractors. And standing off to the side, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, looking smug as ever was Margaret. I stormed up to her, rage boiling beneath my skin. "Tell me you are not this stupid." Margaret turned, her fake smile in full force. "Good morning, Mr. Davis. The first see you've met the county's utility relocation team. We're having the transformer moved since you were so reluctant to cooperate." My fists clenched. "You have no authority to do this. This is my land." Margaret's smile widened. "Oh, I think you'll find the paperwork says otherwise." She handed me a stack of forged documents. I didn't even have to read them to know what she had done. She faked county approval. I turned to the contractor closest to me. "You're trespassing. Every single one of you. This is private property. Unless you have an official work order from Pinewood Electric, the first suggests you start packing up your tools." The contractor, a grizzled man in his 50s, looked uneasy. He glanced between me and Margaret. "Ma'am, is this legal? We were told this was HOA jurisdiction." "She lied," I said flatly. "And if you don't get off my land in the next 60 seconds, I'm calling the sheriff and suing your company for property damage." Margaret's eyes flared. "You're being ridiculous." "No, Margaret," I said, stepping closer, voice ice cold. "You're being criminal." The contractor hesitated another second before sighing. "Boys, pack it up. We're leaving." Margaret whipped toward him. "What? I don't do jobs without clear legal paperwork, lady," he snapped, already waving his workers back. "I'm not risking my license over some HOA nonsense." Margaret's entire face twisted in rage as she turned back to me. "You'll regret this, Davis." I smiled. "No, Margaret. You will." She had just given me exactly what I needed. An airtight case of attempted property destruction and fraud. By nightfall, I had already contacted the county records office, my lawyer, and the local news. The next morning, I had one more surprise waiting, a cease and desist order. Not for me. For Margaret and the HOA. I had officially filed for a lawsuit. And, as a final cherry on top, Sheriff Reynolds had taken a particular interest in Margaret's forged documents. Forgery. Fraud. Illegal trespassing. Margaret wasn't just in trouble, she was about to go down hard. Margaret had finally pushed too far. By the time the sheriff showed up at her doorstep with a warrant in hand, the entire neighborhood was watching. Evergreen Meadows' perfect little suburban bubble had officially burst. I got the call from Sheriff Reynolds early that morning. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "We're bringing her in for fraud, trespassing, and attempted property destruction." I barely had time to grab my coffee before the flashing lights started reflecting off my window. From my porch, I watched Margaret stomp out of her pristine house, barking at the officers like she still had an ounce of control left. "This is an outrage," she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I am the HOA president." Reynolds barely looked up as he cuffed her. "And you're under arrest." The moment Margaret was shoved into the back of the police car, the entire neighborhood came alive. People whispered, some shocked, others relieved. A few of her former allies looked like they were reconsidering every choice they had ever made. Then, someone clapped. Then another. And then, a full-blown applause erupted. The people who had been bullied by Margaret for years finally saw justice served. And me? I just stood there, arms crossed, watching as my biggest headache was driven away. 2 weeks later, the Evergreen Meadows HOA officially collapsed. The board members resigned in disgrace. The HOA funds were frozen pending a full audit. And every bogus fine Margaret had issued was overturned. And just to make sure no one ever tried pulling this nonsense again, I built a damn fence. A big, beautiful, impossible to miss fence that marked my property so clearly even the most entitled suburbanite couldn't pretend it belonged to them. Rusty and I stood by it that evening, watching the sunset, feeling the kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. Margaret had lost. And I had won. Completely. Evergreen Meadows would never be the same, and neither would I.